The first time the northern wind carried her name across the ice, it whispered it with reverence, as if even the storm respected her strength. She walked alone through landscapes that broke the spirits of traveling men, yet the cold never dared to break hers. And long before the frostbitten stranger collapsed near her hunting grounds, the giant huntress had already decided that men were too fragile for the land of endless winter. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. She moved across the tundra the way ancient stories describe spirits: silent, deliberate, shaped from bone, endurance, and inherited memory. Even in the dim blue hours of Arctic dawn, her silhouette towered above the drifts, wrapped in heavy furs stitched with symbols passed down from grandmothers whose voices lived only in the wind now. The ice beneath her feet sang with low groans, the shifting language of a land alive and always watching. She knew its moods as well as her own, and rarely did it surprise her. Her people called her Niluk, the one who walks through storms, because no matter how violent the blizzard, she always returned, dragging caribou or seal behind her, unfazed by the kind of cold that cracked the lips and sanity of most men. For years she carried a truth sharpened like the blade sheathed at her hip. The land chose only the strongest to survive, and in her lifetime she had watched too many outsiders underestimate its cruelty. Men especially arrived with arrogance in their packs: southern fishermen seeking new waters, reckless explorers craving glory, wounded souls fleeing themselves, but the cold humbled them all. She found their tracks often scattered and chaotic, shaped by panic. Sometimes she found pieces of their camps, half devoured by storms; other times she found worse. Life taught her early that the ice was not merciful, and she hardened herself accordingly. Strength to her was not loud, it was not boastful. It was quiet, enduring, patient, and in her world, men rarely were. The morning she sensed the stranger, the wind tasted different, sharper, carrying the faint metallic edge of human suffering. She lifted her head from field dressing a seal and felt it ripple across her skin, an instinct older than language. Something out there was failing. Something out there was drifting toward death. She had felt it before. The land always announced when a living thing was losing its battle against the cold. Most times she ignored it. Mercy, she had learned, was a luxury the tundra did not often reward. Yet this time she hesitated, pressing a gloved hand to the snow as if listening through the ground itself. Beneath the surface, the muffled pulse of the ice shifted in a way she could not explain. It unsettled her. The sun, low and pale, barely warmed her face as she stood and surveyed the horizon, searching for any sign that the wind's message had roots in reality. Nothing but endless ridges of snow, sculpted into frozen waves. No tracks, no plume of breath, no shadow fighting against the blinding white. Yet the instinct gnawed at her ribs, refusing to quiet itself. She slung the seal over her shoulder, its weight insignificant to her massive frame, and began walking toward the northwest, where the air felt thinnest, weakest, as if something or someone had disturbed the land's rhythm. She moved with the discipline of someone raised on survival rather than comfort. Every step pressed deep into snow hardened by the previous night's freeze. Her fur hood scratched against her jawline as she lowered her head into the wind, letting the sting of flying ice sharpen her focus. The land stretched silent around her, but the silence carried layers: distance, warning, cold breath, shifting pressure. She could read it all, and somewhere beneath it pulsed a faint, irregular note of human life struggling not to extinguish itself. Hours slipped by, measured only by the slow arc of the pale sun. Finally she reached a frozen ridge and paused, sensing movement below. Her eyes narrowed. Something had collapsed against the base of the ice shelf, half buried in drifting snow, unmoving, fragile as a fallen bird. She descended the slope with the caution of a predator, boots crunching against brittle crust. The wind parted briefly, revealing what lay beneath: a man, frost clinging to his eyelashes, beard stiff with ice, clothing torn and utterly inadequate for the northern cold. His breath came in shallow bursts, each one weaker than the last. Had she arrived 10 minutes later, she knew the land would have claimed him. For a long moment, she simply stared, towering above him like a spirit of judgment. She did not recognize his features, but she recognized the look of a man who had already accepted death. His skin carried the bluish tint of advanced chill, fingers curled inward, body curled tight in instinctive surrender. Fragile. The word echoed through her mind with a sting of vindication. She had been right about men like him, souls who ventured into these lands without understanding their brutality. Souls who believed endurance was measured by willpower alone, not by generations of knowledge carved into bone and memory. She could have left him. The land would have erased his presence by morning, covering him with drifting snow until he became another story told at the edges of village firelight. But something about the way he lay there, something about the faint rise and fall of breath that defied the cold's claim, made her hesitate. She knelt beside him, her shadow engulfing his body, and felt the heat of her own strength radiate against his near-frozen skin. When his eyelids fluttered, barely lifting, she saw the rawest thing a person could carry in their eyes. Not weakness, not fear, but surrender mixed with an ancient longing to be saved. And for the first time in many years, the giant huntress felt her certainty crack. The decision to move him did not come quickly, and that alone startled her. Nilek was not a woman who hesitated. The land did not reward hesitation. For years she had trained herself to act with the clean, sharp efficiency of a blade. Assess, decide, move. Yet here, kneeling beside this half-frozen stranger, she felt time elongate, as if the ice itself were holding its breath. The wind circled them in slow, testing gusts, lifting small spirals of snow that danced briefly and then died. She studied him, her dark eyes tracing the lines of his face, the cracked lips, the frostbitten ears, the way his jaw shivered with the last scraps of warmth his body was still determined to protect. He did not fit here. Everything about him screamed of another life, another place, another climate in which he might have appeared competent, perhaps even strong. But here, in her world, he was as breakable as thin glass beneath a heavy boot. Still, when his lash twitched and his eyes opened a fraction, she saw a flicker of awareness. It was not the wild panic of someone afraid of death, but the quiet bewilderment of someone surprised to still be alive. That small defiance against the inevitable pressed against something buried deep inside her chest. She leaned further over him, her shadow blocking the worst of the wind, and felt the raw contrast between their conditions. Her body was encased in layers of thick fur, skin warm from endless movement, muscles accustomed to pulling weight through resistance. His body, by contrast, had surrendered to the cold's invasion. She could hear it in his breathing, shallow and ragged, each inhale a negotiation. His gloved hand twitched weakly in the snow, fingers barely flexing. For a brief moment she considered the old teachings, how the land belonged to those who understood it, how mercy could cost a life if extended at the wrong time, how every extra burden threatened survival in a place that consumed energy without remorse. Bringing him back would slow her. It would cost her fuel, food, time. It would invite risk. But another current moved beneath those practical calculations, an older, quieter current, formed from stories her grandmother told about the spirits of the ice and the way they watched how humans treated one another when storms closed in. The memory of those stories did not soften her. It merely added another layer to the weight she now carried. She slipped her arms under his body with practiced control, feeling the limp heaviness of an exhausted frame. He was not as large as she had first assumed. The bulk of his clothing made him seem bigger, but beneath the layers she sensed the thinness of someone who had gone too long without enough food, enough rest, enough safety. As she lifted him, a pained sound escaped his throat, half groan, half exhale, and his head fell against her shoulder with the boneless collapse of a man who had run out of strength long before he had run out of distance. She exhaled once, a slow cloud of steam rising between them, and rose to her full height, cradling him as if he were nothing more than an extra pelt slung across her arms. The wind tried to bite at any exposed skin it could reach, but she adjusted her furs and his position until the worst of the cold was blocked. Then, with seal and stranger both, she turned her back to the ridge and began the long walk home. The landscape did not change to accommodate her burden. The tundra did not care that she now carried two lives instead of one. Each step pressed deep into the snow, demanding strength from legs that had already worked for hours. Her breath grew heavier, forming denser clouds that broke apart in the wind. The weight across her arms and shoulders shifted occasionally, forcing her to readjust her grip, to brace her core, to lean slightly into the wind for better balance. Yet she did not slow more than necessary. The rhythm of her movement became a kind of prayer, not with words, but with action. Each step said, "Not yet, you do not take him yet." The ice creaked and sighed beneath her, ancient and indifferent, but the sky above remained clear enough for her to navigate. She aimed her body toward the familiar shapes that only she could interpret at such distance: subtle rises in the land, clusters of dark rock, patterns in the wind's flow. The stranger's shallow breaths warmed a small circle of fur near her shoulder, and in that warmth she recognized a fragile insistence on living. As she walked, fragments of earlier years rose unbidden in her mind, carried by the rhythm of her steps. She remembered the first time she watched an outsider die on the ice, a man too proud to ask for guidance, too stubborn to heed warnings about thin surfaces masked by drifted snow. The next spring, when the ice gave up what it had taken, they found his body, twisted and pale, eyes still open as if surprised by the suddenness of his end. Her father had said nothing as they brought the man back to the village. He hadn't needed to. The land had spoken for him. Later that year another stranger arrived, eager to fish in waters he thought untouched. He stayed for one winter, then left, muttering about a cold that felt like punishment. Niluk had watched these patterns repeat until she concluded, with quiet certainty, that men were not built for this kind of endurance. They broke too easily, emotionally and physically. They sought escape more often than adaptation. She, on the other hand, had never been granted the option of escape. The land had woven itself into her bones, and she had become its daughter by necessity, not choice. By the time she saw the first outline of her settlement, the low dark shapes of homes half buried in snow, the faint column of smoke rising from a communal cooking fire, her arms ached with a deep, burning fatigue. She did not complain. Pain was a companion, not an enemy. It reminded her she was still moving. As she approached the cluster of houses, a few villagers lifted their heads, eyes widening at the sight of the limp form in her arms. They were used to seeing her return with heavy game, dragging weight across the ice with a calm that would have broken most backs. But this was different. This was human. A few steps from her own home, an older woman intercepted her, gaze sharp as a raven's. "You brought trouble," the elder murmured, not unkindly but with the blunt honesty of someone who had seen how quickly complications could multiply in a harsh climate. Nilak's jaw tightened. "I brought a life that isn't finished yet," she replied, shifting the weight in her arms. The elder held her gaze for a beat, then nodded once and stepped aside. That was all the permission she would get and all she needed. Inside her house, warmth met them in a wave, a thick, slow-moving comfort that smelled of burning wood, dried fish, and the faint herbal notes of medicines drying near the hearth. She lowered the man carefully onto a padded surface made of layered skins and woven mats, brushing snow and ice from his clothes with swift, efficient motions. His face, now fully exposed to the firelight, told the story she had already suspected. Exhaustion carved into his features, worrying etched into lines around his mouth and eyes, a kind of grief clinging to him even unconscious. She stripped away the top layers of his soaked clothing, working quickly to peel frozen fabric from his skin before the dampness could steal what little heat he still carried. Modesty was a concern of softer lands. Here, survival outranked embarrassment. Once she had dried his upper body as best she could and wrapped him in thick furs, she sat back on her heels and studied him again, searching for signs of deeper injury. His hands drew her attention, fingers reddened, swollen, some tipped with the pale, waxy color that made her stomach clench. Frostbite, not the worst she had seen, but severe enough that the consequences would not be small. To the untrained eye, his hands might still look salvageable. To hers, they were a map of choices he had made, distances he had walked, mistakes he had repeated even when his body begged him to stop. She took one of his hands between her own, feeling the disturbing mix of numbness and cold stiffness beneath the skin. Slowly, carefully, she began to warm them, not directly over heat, which would damage them further, but with the steady insulation of her own body warmth and soft cloth warmed near the fire. The work was delicate, requiring patience. As she pressed his hand between hers, she felt a faint tremor from deep inside his arm, a delayed response from a nervous system that refused to fully shut down. Fragile, she thought again, but the word no longer sounded like condemnation. It sounded like an acknowledgement of how all bodies, in the end, struggled before the vastness of the cold. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of effort. She alternated between tending to his hands, checking his breathing, and feeding more fuel to the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up again, throwing small bursts of snow against the walls, but inside, the small world she had created around the stranger remained warm and steady. At one point his eyelids fluttered, and he tried to speak. The sound that came out was rough and incomprehensible, his mouth to dry and his mind to fog to form words. She pressed a cup of warm, diluted broth gently to his lips, tilting it just enough for one swallow at a time. He choked on the first sip, then managed the next, his throat working slowly as his body remembered the act of receiving nourishment. Slivers of awareness slipped in and out of his gaze, but he never fully woke. That was fine with her. Conscious men tended to ask questions she had no interest in answering, not until she understood what kind of soul she had brought into her home. While he drifted between sleep and half-awareness, her thoughts traveled again to the sentence that had become almost a shield for her over the years. Men are too fragile. How many times had she said it around the cooking fire, after news of another southern expedition gone wrong? How many times had she muttered it under her breath while patching gear abandoned by those who could not endure? The phrase had become a wall she leaned on, a way of explaining why she walked through storms alone, why she did not seek companionship beyond what the village required. Men, in her experience, left. They broke, they underestimated. They craved praise more than the discipline of survival. But now, as she watched this stranger cling to life by the thinnest of threads, she felt the statement wobble inside her. Fragility was not always a flaw. Sometimes it was the last honest thing a body had left to show an admission of vulnerability that demanded care, not judgment. As dusk bled slowly into night again, the interior of her home glowed with the soft, flickering light of the fire. Shadows moved lazily along the walls, expanding and shrinking with the flames, like ancient spirits leaning in to witness what unfolded. Nilak's muscles ached from the long day, but she did not allow herself rest. Instead, she sat near the stranger's side, elbows on her knees, hands clasped loosely as she watched the rise and fall of his chest. It had become the metronome of the room, the quiet proof that her effort had not been meaningless. She wondered, for the first time, who he had been before the ice tried to claim him, what loss had driven him north, what mistakes he carried in his silence, what kind of man walked willingly into a landscape that did not forgive. The answers did not matter yet, for now, he was simply a life suspended between worlds, temporarily anchored in her care. Outside, the wind howled louder, scraping against the roof like claws, but inside, she felt something unexpected. Not annoyance at the added strain, not resentment for the burden she had chosen, but a low, steady hum of purpose, as if the land itself were watching, waiting to see what would grow from this unlikely collision of paths. She thought again of the moment she had found him at the base of the ridge. The way his half-open eyes seemed almost resigned. There had been something else there too, something that looked painfully familiar. Not weakness, not cowardice, a kind of tiredness that went deeper than the body. The kind of tiredness she had seen in the mirror on certain mornings, when the weight of her own memories pressed a little too heavily between her ribs. Long after the village quieted and the last exterior sounds dimmed to a background murmur, she remained awake, holding vigil in her own stoic way. Her gaze softened but never fully relaxed. She did not yet know that this frostbitten stranger would unmake and remake the sentence she had carried like armor for years, nor that his presence would carve new questions into the bedrock of her beliefs. She only knew that, for reasons she could not fully explain, she had refused to let the land finish with him. And somewhere beyond the thick walls and the swirling snow, the ancient ice groaned as if shifting slightly in its sleep, acknowledging that something, however small, had changed. She adjusted the fur around his shoulders one more time, then leaned back, her eyes finally growing heavier. As she hovered on the edge of sleep, one last thought drifted through her mind, not as a declaration, but as a quiet possibility she did not yet dare to say aloud. Perhaps fragility was not the opposite of strength. Perhaps, in a land that broke men so easily, surviving long enough to collapse in the snow and still breathe when help arrived was its own kind of endurance. The stranger did not wake fully during the first night, but the house changed because of his presence. The fire seemed to burn with a different rhythm, the light pulsing softly against the walls, as if responding to another heartbeat inside the room. Nilak slept lightly, her instincts sharpened by years of surviving the unpredictable moods of the ice. Even in sleep she remained attuned to every sound, the shifting of wood, the faint crackle of embers, the strained exhale of the man who clung to the warmth she had built around him. When she finally stirred, the dim blue light of Arctic dawn pressed gently through the sealskin curtain, illuminating the space in a quiet palette of silver and ice blue. She rose slowly, stretching muscles stiff from the long vigil, and for a moment she simply stood there, towering over the fragile shape beneath the furs, feeling the strange intertwining of duty and something else she could not yet name. When she knelt beside him again, the coldness of his skin had lessened, replaced by the hesitant warmth of a body returning from the edge. His breathing had steadied, though it still carried the uneven rhythm of someone recovering not only from exposure but from exhaustion embedded deep within bone. She reached out and lifted one of his hands, no longer waxen, but still frighteningly pale. The swelling remained, particularly in the fingertips where the cold had bitten hardest. She examined him silently, her touch neither gentle nor harsh but precise. She knew the land took pieces from those who underestimated it. She knew the price of wandering unprepared. And now she wondered what kind of story had pushed him into the north with so little protection. People rarely fled south to north unless they were running from something or toward something too painful to face anywhere else. When he shifted slightly, a faint groan escaped his lips, and Nilek paused. His eyelids fluttered, shadows moving beneath them like dreams he could not escape. She watched with the stillness of a hunter waiting for a sign of motion. Slowly, his eyes opened, not fully, but enough for her to glimpse the muddled confusion within them. For a brief instant he seemed to see nothing, staring through her like someone newly returned from a long, cold absence. Then his gaze sharpened just enough to acknowledge her outline. Fear did not ignite in him. Instead, a strange calm settled over his expression, as if he sensed, even in his weakened state, that she was not his enemy. He attempted to speak, but the sound was broken, his lips cracked and throat too dry to shape meaning. She reached for a small bowl of warm broth, lifting it toward his mouth. He managed to swallow to careful sips before exhaustion dragged him back into unconsciousness. She sat back, elbows resting on her knees, and studied him with the contemplative silence of someone piecing together a puzzle in the snow. His features did not belong to any nearby village. He was an outsider through and through. His clothing was southern-made, factory-stitched and unsuited for the brutality of northern travel. His boots were good quality but worn to thin, as if he had walked farther than they were meant to endure. Strips of fabric along his sleeves were torn, suggesting he had pushed through brambles or ice formations sharp enough to rend cloth. A man who had prepared poorly would have stayed home after the first warning signs. A man who prepared well would not have ended up half dead in the snow. This man was neither careless nor competent. He was something in between, a contradiction the land had nearly consumed. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence with its steady voice. Nilek rose to fetch more wood from the small stack near the entrance, her movements deliberate and slow. When she returned, she added a few pieces to the flames, watching the sparks leap upward before settling into orange glow. She had lived many winters and brought many animals into this house for cleaning, but bringing a man here felt different. He was not prey, not a guest, not a companion, not a threat. He was suspended in a space between all those identities. And though she told herself she had only acted because a life lay in front of her on the edge of death, she could not shake the quiet pull in her chest that had made her stop on that ridge. Something in the stranger's brokenness had spoken to something in her, something she tried hard never to acknowledge. Outside, the village slowly awakened. The sound of distant scraping told her someone was clearing snow from a rooftop. A soft bark indicated one of the sled dogs demanding attention. A few children ran past her window, their boots crunching against the hardened crust of snow, laughter echoing like tiny bells. These familiar sounds reminded her that life continued despite storms, despite strangers being pulled back from the brink. Yet she remained rooted near the fire, unable to fully turn away from the man who had breached her solitude. She wondered what stories he carried beneath his silence. She wondered if he had anyone waiting for him beyond these icy borders. She wondered, though she hated admitting it even to herself, whether he would live long enough to answer. The hours drifted by in slow, measured quiet. At one point, as she checked his bandaged hands again, she noticed his lips moving faintly, as if forming words inaudible to her. His brow tightened, and his breath shuddered with the weight of unseen memories. She knew the look well. She had worn it herself on nights when the past pressed too hard against her ribs. The land did not allow many luxuries, but it did allow solitude, and solitude had a way of making the unspoken resurface. What haunted him, what grief or mistake clung to him so tightly that he had chosen to face the Arctic winter alone? She almost spoke to say something grounding, something to pull him from whatever inner struggle gripped him, but her voice remained still. Words were not tools she used lightly. When the sun dipped again toward the horizon, casting the room in amber shadows, she removed the last of his frozen outer garments and replaced them with warm furs. This time, his eyes flickered open wider, revealing a clearer awareness. He looked at her, truly looked, and in that searching gaze she saw gratitude, confusion, and something raw, something that resembled shame. He tried to push himself upright, instinctive pride catching up with his fading strength, but she placed a firm hand on his shoulder, grounding him. The movement was gentle, but the meaning was firm. He was in no condition to pretend he was anything but fragile. He relaxed slightly under her hand, and a faint sigh escaped him. For the first time, she heard his voice in something resembling words, though they were barely more than a whisper. "Thank you." The syllables broke apart like thin ice underweight, but they carried sincerity strong enough to linger in the air between them. She tilted her head, acknowledging the effort without encouraging further strain. It surprised her how much the sound of his voice affected her. It was not the softness of it, nor the vulnerability. It was the recognition buried within that fragility of a man who knew he owed his life to someone who had every reason to walk away. When he drifted back into sleep, Nilek found herself sitting beside him longer than necessary, watching the rise and fall of his chest with a focus that unsettled her. The sentence she had carried for years, "men are too fragile," echoed again in her mind, but now it carried a different texture, as if softened by something she had not anticipated. She still believed what the land had taught her. But as she looked at the stranger, alive against all odds, another thought emerged quietly in the depths of her consciousness. Fragility was not weakness. Sometimes it was the mark of someone who had endured everything and kept going until their body forced them to stop. As night crept fully across the sky, she added more wood to the fire and settled into her usual place near the hearth. The stranger slept, the warmth of the room cradling him in a way the land never had. And Nilek watched him, her breath steady, her heartbeat calm, as a truth she did not yet understand began threading itself into her life. Saving him had been the first step, understanding him would be the second. And what came after that, whatever path their lives were now intertwined upon, remained a mystery as vast as the frozen horizon beyond her door. Dawn rose like a slow breath across the snowfields, tinting the world in pale amber and muted silver. The fire inside Nilek's home burned low, but it had done its work well. The stranger's body no longer trembled, his breath no longer hovered unevenly between struggle and surrender. When she approached him that morning, she sensed a difference that went beyond physical improvement. It was in the subtle peace softening the lines of his face, in the way his shoulders had released from the tension they carried even in sleep, in the way the room felt less like a shelter for a dying man and more like the threshold of something stirring back to life. She lowered herself onto the furs beside him, and for a long moment she simply watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, listening to the quiet rhythm that marked his return to the world. The land had spared him. She had carried him the rest of the way. And now, as sunlight filtered through the sealskin curtain, she understood that what she had done was not merely an act of rescue, it was an invitation to a new story neither of them had expected. When his eyes opened, they carried clarity for the first time since the ridge. They were tired eyes, shadowed by grief and long miles, but they were undeniably alive. For several breaths he lay still, as if testing the boundary between dream and waking. Then he turned his head, meeting her gaze with a vulnerability that surprised them both. In that quiet exchange he seemed to realize fully where he was and who had kept him there. He tried once more to lift himself, but this time his movement held no desperation, no stubborn pride. He rose slowly, bracing a hand against the furs, and she placed a steadying arm behind his back without hesitation. He accepted the support, and when their eyes met again, something in him softened entirely. Not thanks, not awe, recognition, like two people meeting on opposite ends of a long silence. She brought him a bowl of broth, and he drank with more strength than before. A faint tremor still traveled through his fingers, but his grip had purpose now. With each swallow, color returned to his face, warming his skin from the hollowed blue of frostbite into something human again. When he finally set the bowl aside, he looked around the room, the carved wooden charms near the roof beams, the bone-handled tools, the thick pelts lining the walls, the fire that glowed with the steady patience of a guardian. His gaze lingered on the intricate stitching of her clothing, the furs across her shoulders, the quiet weight of her presence. "You saved me," he said softly, voice still rough but carrying a sincerity that resonated in the air between them. "I was already gone when you found me." She shook her head once, slow and firm. "No," she answered, "you were lost, not gone. Lost things can be brought back." He lowered his eyes, his lash casting shadows against his cheeks. For a moment he fought an expression she recognized immediately, not weakness, but the unmistakable ache of someone remembering the exact moment their life had come undone. She did not push him to speak. The ice taught her long ago that some truths needed silence before they were ready to surface. Instead, she added wood to the fire and positioned herself across from him, her posture tall and grounded, giving him space to gather his words. When he finally lifted his head, his voice carried a weight that felt older than the storm that nearly claimed him. "I walked north because I didn't know where else to go," he confessed. "I thought the cold might numb everything." His voice faltered, but he did not break. "I wasn't trying to die. I just didn't know how to keep living where I was." Nelik did not pity him. Pity was shallow, a feeling that melted too quickly to hold any real warmth. What she felt instead was recognition, deep and unspoken. She knew what it meant to carry weight without knowing where to set it down. She knew what it meant to walk alone through storms because solitude hurt less than the memories left behind. She had long believed that men were too fragile for such burdens, but as she watched him now, she understood something her younger self had not. The land did not measure strength by absence of pain. It measured strength by endurance in the face of it. And this man, fragile though he appeared, had walked farther into the ice than many would dare, carrying a sorrow heavy enough to shatter most people long before the cold touched them. "You endured," she said quietly, "even when the land pushed against you." He gave a small, almost disbelieving laugh. "It didn't feel like endurance." She shook her head. "Endurance rarely does." For the first time a faint, grateful smile touched his mouth, soft, hesitant, but real. And in that fleeting moment she saw not a stranger and not a burden, but a man at the beginning of rebuilding himself, standing on the fragile space between survival and purpose. She realized then that fate had not thrown him onto the ice to test his strength. It had pushed him toward her so that each could begin to understand the shapes of their own. When the fire crackled loudly, the sound broke the thin tension between them in a way that felt almost ceremonial. He shifted, adjusting the furs around him, and she noticed his posture straightened despite the lingering pain. He looked toward the door, where faint beams of sunlight seeped through the seams, illuminating tiny particles of frost suspended in the air. "It's beautiful here," he murmured. "Terrifying, but beautiful." She followed his gaze. "The land shows both sides," she said. "It gives, it takes, and sometimes it returns what it almost claimed." He turned back to her, eyes steady. "You could have left me," he said. "Most people would have, out there." Her response came without hesitation. "Most people are not me." For the first time since he arrived, silence did not feel heavy. It felt shared, like a blanket stretched between two souls who had weathered different storms only to find themselves sheltered in the same firelit room. He watched her with a new expression, thoughtful and open, as if beginning to understand the scale of the strength she carried. And she watched him with eyes that no longer saw fragility as a failing, but as a truth capable of transformation. She realized with startling clarity that saving his life had also shifted something in hers, a crack in her armor, not from weakness, but from recognition. The land had taught her that stories rarely ended where they began. And this story, the one shaped by cold wine and unlikely mercy, was no exception. She stood, towering and resolute, and extended a hand to him, not to pull him to his feet, not yet, but to mark the beginning of a path neither could walk alone. He looked at her hand for a long moment before taking it, the warmth of his fingers threading into hers in a gesture that felt not fragile but profoundly human. In that moment something subtle and irrevocable shifted between them. She no longer saw him as proof of man's weakness, and he no longer saw her as an untouchable force carved from ice and myth. Outside, the Arctic wind softened, carrying with it the first quiet promise of a new season. Inside, to lives once on the verge of ending and one accustomed to walking alone stepped into a new beginning with the shared knowledge that strength and fragility were not opposites, but to halves of survival. And on that silent morning, in the warmth of her firelit home, Nilek understood at last. Men were not too fragile. Some were simply waiting for a place and a person strong enough to let them begin again.